Tonight we are going to make a hearty Irish beer and beef stew. And then we're going to make some homemade pretzels. I already have the dough rising in the oven. And then we're going to prep our sourdoughs for tomorrow. So let's start by getting our beef stew, our beef cut up and in the pot to stew. We're going to add about a tablespoon of oil to my Dutch oven. And this is my Dutch oven soup pot, which has like a rounded base. And then I've got about, I want to say 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds of beef stew meat. But when you get beef stew meat, it's so big. I'm going to cut it up into slightly smaller pieces so that it's easier to manage and will cook up and tenderize a little bit faster. So we're just going to chop them up and then add them into our oil that is heating up. We got this stew meat at Costco, and I buy like, those big packs. I think it was like almost a 5.5, 6 pound pack. And, I like to then divide it up into 2 meals. I think trying to remember what we made with it early. Oh yes, we made a lovely shepherd's pie earlier this week with it. And so now we're going to use it to make some nice beef stew. So you want to cut it up into nice, easy, bite-sized pieces. And then we'll start searing them off in our Dutch oven. And we're just kind of continuing on our little Irish theme this week because St. Patty's Day is coming up. Only a couple more days until it's here. My kids are very, very excited because when they wake up in the morning, they get little green cauldrons full of little treats for St. Patrick's Day. I always like to go big for holidays here. I know it's a little crazy, but my kids look forward to it every single year. And it's like, they always get like a green themed piece of clothing. And then, because, you got to wear green on St. Patrick's Day or you get pinched. And then they have, rainbow candies. I always get leprechaun gold, like chocolate leprechaun coins or gold coins in there, a little treat. Got some Skittles, taste the rainbow. But they always get that every year. And they're very excited because we've got our little cauldrons down and they're very excited. My 9-year-old especially, she's like, I can't wait for it. So they'll be excited to have that. But while we're getting in the theme, my kids have been home from spring break this week. So they've been enjoying the St. Patrick's theme, the cookies and the cupcakes and the donuts. So they've been living their best life. Okay, we're almost done. Just a few more pieces of our stew meat. And this is going to be for our Irish beef and beer stew. I was deciding whether I wanted to use Guinness or this George Killian's red beer. And I've already used Guinness a couple times this week. And so I opted to try this red beer and see how it is. I think it will be a bit lighter in touch on the stew, which I think will be my kids will like it a little bit more because they don't like a super strong like beer taste. I once made a beef stew with a strong beer taste before and they were not a fan of it. But I think this one will be a bit more mild for them than the Guinness. Because if you've ever had Guinness, it's a strong beer. Okay, we've got just a few more. Some of these pieces at the end are actually fairly small, which is perfect. Okay, so now I'm done with my cleaver, which if you don't have a cleaver and you cut up a lot of meat, it is great. Let me give my hands a quick rinse. Okay, and then let me get a spatula out here, and we're just gonna stir them in there, and then I'm going to sprinkle some pepper and some garlic salt over the meat just to give it a little flavor now. So we're going to use about a teaspoon or so of garlic salt and probably our same thing, around a teaspoon of black pepper. And this is just to season up our meat now. We're just going to shake it out. There we go. And then I'm going to give it a nice toss. And we're going to just let this brown and cook up. And while this is browning, we are going to prep our sourdough breads for tomorrow. Since if you've never made sourdough before, it takes about a day and a half to 2 days before you have your actual meal. So we've got our 2 bowls. We fed our starter at lunch today. So first we're going to start by adding 100 grams of active starter to each one of my bowls. We're going to do a traditional, like a plain sourdough, and then I'm going to do an herb sourdough. So I'm going to use a bunch of fresh herbs and make a really herby flavored one. I'm going to give it a nice stir. And then we're going to add 100 grams, which is like around 1/3 of a cup. But again, I always like to use my scale because in baking, I feel like you have to be a bit more accurate. There we go. So we've got 100 grams in this one. And then let's add 100 grams to this bowl. There we go. Almost. So close. The other day I had a perfect drop. I dropped it in one big drop and it was right at 100 grams. Okay, and then to each of these bowls, we're going to add 375 grams of warm water. You want warm water because it's going to help hydrate the flour faster. So, and I will say 375 grams of water is about 1.5 cups. Okay, and then let's get this guy on. And you want to use definitely warm water. It will help it incorporate much faster into the flour than it will with like cold water. Perfect. Okay. Dry this up. I spilt a little water right here, and we're going to be rolling out pretzels on this in a little bit, and I don't want it to be super wet. Okay, and now I'm going to give each one a little mix. I'm just using my dough whisk, and this is just to make sure that the starter is completely dispersed among the water so that it will be equally hydrated into the flour. There we go. Beautiful. And then I'm just going to come over here and give our stew meat a quick stir. There we go. Now we're going to add in about 2 teaspoons of salt to each one of my bowls. And I'm just going to measure it out in my hand. It's about, if you're going to do measurement wise, between 8 and 10 grams of salt. But I eyeball it. There we go. And then we are going to add 500 grams of unbleached bread flour to each one. And that is about 3 cups, give or take. But again, I like to use my scale because it's better to be a little bit more accurate in baking. So that's 1, 2, let's see if we're, there we go. So we'll add this one. And then we're going to add, again, about 3 cups to make about 500 grams.
You have a question?
Yes.
How far in advance do you meal plan?
You know what? I'm not a person who actually like meal plans so much as I buy ingredients at the store, like what looks good. And then each day I'm like, what are we going to have today? And then I figure something out. I feel like with certain base ingredients, you can make so many different meals. Now, there are occasionally where I will buy a specific ingredient for a meal, like, but I will say a lot of times, and my kids hate this, my husband hates this, they're like, what's for dinner? And I'm like, I haven't decided yet, but I have so many different options to cook up, and then I get it in the morning. So I just go to the store once a week and buy up my ingredients, and then I always have certain staples in my house so I can make a wide range of things, because you just never know what you're going to feel like each day.
I'll answer this question. About 90 minutes before dinner, she'll decide what she's making.
Yep, that is true. And it drives me insane when my kids ask me what's for dinner 27,000 times a day. I used to write it up on the board in the morning. But that seemed like too much work. And then when they'd ask me, I was like, check the board, even though I could have said it out loud, but I was like, check the board. So yeah, I'm like a spur of the moment, I'm a procrastinator. That's what it comes down to. I'm a really big procrastinator, but I always get everything done. Okay, so we've got that mixed up. And then we're starting with the base, the same base for both of ours, but the one we will add in a bunch of fresh herbs when we do our first stretch and fold. So it'll be like a really herby inclusion for it. And then we're going to get this guy all mixed up. But this is really all, if you wanted to do just a plain loaf, this is all you do. It's super simple. And then, of course, there's just stretch and folds and, a little bit of rolling it out into, and then rolling it up and letting it sit. It's a lot of wait time with sourdough. If you've never done it, it's not hard work. It's just a lot of wait time. There we go. So I've got my 2 doughs, and we're going to let them sit here. And then towards the end of dinner, or making dinner, we're going to do our stretch and folds and put in some of our inclusions. But let's get onto our stew, and then we'll do our pretzels. Okay, we give that a nice little stir. Get my drinks out of the way here, guys. We're going to chop up 1 yellow onion. So I'm going to just start by taking off the ends of each one, and then I'm just going to do a nice little slit through so I can peel this whole outer shell off, because that's always the chewy part of the onion. It never cooks up nice. And then let's cut these in half, and we're just going to do a simple dice. So I'm going to make about 4 to 5 slices down, and then I'm going to come back and make little squares. There we go. Do this again, and then flip. And I always think with our stews, you don't need to have a super small dice on them, because you like a nice little onion bite in there. And we're going to add this to our meat. And then I'm going to give it a nice little stir so it can start cooking up those onions. And then we're going to put in about a spoonful of garlic. Now, you could use fresh if you wanted to. You'd use about 2 to 3, maybe 4 cloves, since it's a good amount of meat. But garlic takes a hot minute to peel and to mince. So I find that the pre-minced one works just great. Gives you the flavor. Now, if I was going to do a meal where garlic was the star, I would definitely use fresh. But for this, where it's going to be masked with a bunch of other flavors, pre-minced is fine. There we go. It's about making things easier. Simplicity. I like to make it the easier route to having a delicious dinner instead of the super hard bougie route. Okay, we've got 5 or so carrots here. I'm going to give it a nice peel. You could use pre-washed baby carrots if you wanted to, and then just chop them up. Or you can even buy the bag of pre-cut carrots if you want to and use those. But I buy my stuff a lot of times in bulk because we are a large family. So we're just going to use these carrots. And this is again for our Irish beef and beer stew. We're going to be using some of George Killian's Irish red beer. Never actually had it before. So I'm not a beer drinker. But
that's supposed to be an Irish accent.
No, that wasn't an Irish accent. That was a uppity up. I don't know if I could do an Irish accent, especially on camera. I feel like I would mess it up. It'd be like my daughter. My daughter can only do one accent. And I remember in class, she was asked to do a German accent for some drama play they were doing. And all she can do is a British pirate accent, a Southern British pirate accent. It's terrible. And her drama teacher was like, "What is that?" And I was like, "Yeah, To me, if you tell me to do an accent, I can't do it. It was just go ahead.
You have a question? How long do you let the dough sit, and will you cook it tonight?
No. So my sourdough what we do is for the next 2 hours, about every 30 minutes, we're going to do a stretch and fold. And then I will sit it on my counter for anywhere between 2 and 6 hours, where it will kind of, do a bulk rise. And then I pop it in my fridge for anywhere between 12 to 48 hours, depending on when I want to bake it up. So sourdough needs time. And so it's not something that you can just say, hey, I want sourdough in the morning. You need a day or at least a good day to do it, like the prep the day before. So we're making them for tomorrow night's dinner. But I will say, I don't want people to be turned off by it because it does take a long amount of time. It is not hard work. It's actually a lot of passive work just with time. You know what I mean? You come in and you do a stretch and fold, and that takes about a minute, 2 minutes, and then you just got to come back in a little while. And you don't have to be exactly on every 30 minutes. I flex it all the time with whatever my schedule is. And it's not too bad. It's just, it's like a day of a lot of passive time with maybe 30 minutes max of active work.
And do you use bread flour for the sourdough?
Yes, I do use bread flour in there because the gluten is what's going to give you that really good crumb on your bread. Okay, we're going to add in our carrots. We're going to let those, give them a nice stir. Beautiful. We're going to let those simmer. And then I have here some gold potatoes, yellow potatoes. And because they are the gold potatoes, I'm not going to peel them. Russet, I would peel, but these have a lovely tender skin, and so you don't need to peel them. And they work a little bit better for stews. Russet potatoes are great for like either French fries or mashed potatoes, but in stews or anywhere where they're going to be in water a long time, they kind of disintegrate. So a yellow potato, a Yukon Gold, a russet, or like the red potatoes, new potatoes, those are much better for stews than the russets. So we're just gonna do some chunks of potato. You gotta think about what you're gonna eat in a stew, so you don't want anything too big. So I'm kind of cutting each potato into thirds and then half again, and then just kind of slicing them down. These will keep their body and their shape for the whole thing because they're just a bit waxier. They're great for stews. And cut these through and then flip. Now, if you do not like skins at all, you don't like the texture, you can definitely give these a peel if you wanted to. But again, I like to save time. So.
You got a question? How the cupcakes turn out from yesterday?
Excellent. There's only like a few left. I think there's 2 left. So they have pretty much disappeared. My husband, who does not like frosting, said he loved the frosting on them. I reused some Bailey's Irish cream in them, and they're just delicious. When you first make them, that like cream is really like spiky, but after a day, the alcohol is completely evaporated out, and they're just lovely, mellow taste. Okay, we've got our potatoes in. I'm gonna give this a nice stir. Here we go. Okay. And then a typical Irish stew wouldn't have mushrooms in it, but we haven't had any mushrooms in our stews this week, and I love mushrooms, so we're gonna add some in. Only a couple of us love mushrooms, but I think they're absolutely delicious.
You have a question, what time is it?
It is about 8:30 here. We are late night eaters, and it's spring break, so we didn't eat lunch until like 2:30ish or whatnot. So we're kind of on a late night schedule. My kids do a lot of sports during the week, and I've got kids at all ages, which means their practice times are at all different times, and a lot of times they don't get done till 8. One of my daughters has practice till 9 o'clock at night. So it's kind of gotta feed them when we can, but a lot of times we don't eat between like 8 and 9. Okay, I'm gonna add my mushrooms in here. I'm gonna give this a nice stir. There we go. And then turn up. We're gonna add in our broth and stuff in just a second, but we're gonna give about a tablespoon to 2 tablespoons of Worcestershire sauce. The acidity of this is gonna make the meat nice and tender, as well as give it a nice flavor and cut through it. You can measure it out, but I eyeball it. So we're just gonna give it a nice stir. And this is gonna be for our Irish beef and beer stew. Okay, and now we're going to add in some tomato paste. And you're gonna want about 2 tablespoons of tomato paste. And this is just gonna give a really lovely flavor to the broth. And tomato paste, if you're not sure what it is, it's like a blended up tomato that has a little bit of oil and salt that has been reduced until all of the liquid is out of it. Did we lose a carrot? Always. And an onion. Okay, and I'm going to stir this up until all of the tomato paste is kind of covering our meat. And then we're going to add in some beer. There we go. Okay, we've got it all covered up. And now we're going to add in some beer. It says it's twist off, but these never twist off. So we're gonna use 1 whole bottle. It's 12 ounces, so that's about 1.5 cups. And I'm just gonna slowly pour it over our meat. And this will all, the alcohol in it will be cooked out by the time the stew is over. So you don't have to worry about there being alcohol in there. I'm gonna give it a nice stir, and we're gonna just let that meat kind of cook in that beer for just a second. And I'm gonna prep some fresh thyme that we are going to be putting in there. Some of our herbs we're gonna put in at the end. So I'm just kind of pulling off the leaves of it for our stew. And this is fresh thyme. It's gonna just be lovely in this soup. You could use dried if you wanted. You'd wanna use about a teaspoon to a teaspoon and a half.
Hey, you have a question? How do you know which herbs to use during cooking and which to hold till the end?
It's kind of thyme. It depends on the flavors that you want. I find parsley and green onions you want at the end because you want that kind of freshness of flavor for it. Thyme and rosemary, sage, and oregano you want to add in because that's going to be flavoring and seasoning it. So most you want, I will say outside of like parsley, like fresh dill and cilantro, you put most of yours in at the beginning, but those you'll hold for this meat. And same thing with chives, because those flavors are very delicate, and if you put them in, you won't really get any flavor out of them. You'll just cook them up. But we want this to flavor our meat. And you could always add a bit of fresh thyme at the end if you want to as a garnish, but we do want these lovely flavors in our stew to help flavor the broth. There we go. They're always not the fun. Like I will say with thyme, you really can't chop it up. You've got to like pull off each individual leaf. So it's not too bad. I think that's good. We'll save a little bit of this for towards the end. And let's stir it in. And you could throw in the whole sprig, like the whole string if you wanted to. But I like to peel it off, and that way my thyme can be more dispersed. Okay, I'm gonna push all of these vegetables down because now we're gonna add in some broth, and we're gonna add a little bit of flour first before we add in our broth. So let me grab my little flour container here. And this is just to help thicken up the stew to be a little bit thicker. So I'm gonna do this before we add in our broth. And I'm gonna add in about 1 to 2 tablespoons. You don't need too much. And I'm just gonna kind of shake it over the top of it. So that's about a tablespoon there. And there you go. And this is gonna really thicken up the broth of our stew. Just kind of like in gravy, the flour really thickens up. So I'm gonna mix this all together in here. And we do have the beer and liquid already in here, and that will just help it mix up. You wanna always sprinkle it over the top instead of dropping it in one big glob, because then you could get like a little dumpling forming. And then you'll just have like a flour glob that won't cook up as well. There we go. And now we are going to add in around 4 cups of broth, but I'm gonna see how it looks when I cover the meat, because I don't want too much broth in it, because this is a stew. I want it to be nice and hearty. So I'm just gonna add enough liquid till it covers the broth or the meat in here and all the vegetables.
What kind of beer did you use?
It was a George Killian's Irish Red. Now you could also use Guinness. Guinness is also a very popular beer. But we had done Guinness in a couple of other things, so I wanted to try something new. I have a little bit more. Again, I want just enough to really kind of cover the meat and the vegetables where they're poking out. So it was, I would say I've added about 3 cups to it. So we have the 12 ounces from the beer, and then we have the 3 cups from here, because I want a nice, hearty, rich stew. And then we are going to add in a spoonful of beef bouillon to give it, so if you didn't want water, you could have used beef broth, but I'm gonna use water and beef bouillon. So I'm gonna see how much I can get out of this jar, and I might have to get into my other beef bouillon jar. Or you could use cubes. You'd wanna use about 4 cubes, 4 to 5 cubes of beef broth. Let me open up. And let me open up my new jar, and we're gonna get a nice big scoop out of here. There you go, because it's about 1 teaspoon per cup of water is what it says on it. And so I always like to add just a pinch more to get a little bit more of that beefy flavor. And this is where also the salt for the soup is. I don't add any extra salt. I just get it from the bouillon, which I think gives it a nice richer flavor. Okay, so now we are going to let this simmer and cook. Once it comes to a boil, I will turn it down. And then really all we're gonna do is add some fresh herbs at the end, but that is pretty much done with that. Let's get out my pretzel dough that I made earlier. So I am a big fan of homemade pretzels. And these are like the American soft pretzels, not the hard, crunchy one. So let me turn this water on, and we're gonna let it start to boil with a little bit of baking soda. So I don't do lye, I just do a baking soda bath. And that's gonna give it kind of its nice shell. And you want about 1/3 of a cup of baking soda in there. And here's our beautiful dough. This is a yeast dough. And let me get my pastry cutter. And this was about, I used 4 cups of bread flour, a tablespoon of yeast, 1.5 cups of warm water, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, and 1/4 cup of melted butter. And then, you know, about a tablespoon of salt, maybe a little less. And that is really all it does. And then you just let it rise. And we're gonna make about 16 pretzels here. So I'm just trying to make sure I have them all cut up as evenly as possible so they bake up as evenly. And so I'm using this as a pastry cutter, and it just slices through. If you don't have one of these, you can just use a knife. But I do a lot of cooking and baking, so I have a fancy pastry cutter. And I have my big, this is a 1.5-sheet baking sheet, and I lined it with parchment paper. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna roll out our pretzels, I'll put them on there, and then what we'll do is we'll dip them in our hot water bath for about 30 seconds on each side, maybe a little less, like between 20 to 30 seconds on each side. And then we'll put them on there. We'll do a quick egg wash, and then we bake them at 450 for about 7 minutes. Now I don't do a traditional pretzel shape simply because I've made this so many times that it's just easier to do kind of a loop and swoop and then I kind of pull through. So it's more like a twisted pretzel roll, but it works. Maybe I'll make one in the traditional shape or a couple in the traditional shape there, but it's like you twist it and then you tuck back through like that. And so this is like the traditional shape and there's my shape. So you could do the traditional, but I find that it's easier to just do my twist and it tastes the same. I always say, I'm like, what can I do to go faster so that we can have good home cooked meals without spending hours on it? And that's what I think everyone's goal is. I said, you know, it's really easy to make a home cooked meal and have it out. You just have to be confident in yourself and then you kind of plan. But when you're cooking, it's like riding a bike. In the beginning, you'll suck at it. But as you get to know it, you get better and you get the trips and trade. So we're rolling out, these are our dough for our soft pretzel rolls that we're gonna be making. And then we're gonna pair that with our Irish beer and beef stew. And then in a little bit, we'll put our inclusion into our sourdough for tomorrow, and then we'll do our stretch and folds. So.
You got a question, what do you put the oven to?
For the pretzels, it's at 450 degrees. So these bake at 450, so a high temperature, but for only about 7 to 8 minutes. So they don't need long to bake. And so it's nice and hot, and always have to make sure your oven's preheated for a good, like, at least at 450 for 10 minutes so that it's truly hot. Because sometimes as soon as it gets up to a preheated temperature, as soon as you open that oven, it brings it down quite a few degrees.
And you got a question, do you have to put them in water first?
So yes, what we'll do is I have my water right here with baking soda, and we're gonna boil it. Once it comes to a boil, we'll dip each one of these in for about 20 to 30 seconds on each side, and then we'll put them right back out, and then we'll do an egg wash on the top of them, and then bake them. So yes, that gives it its nice kind of shell, like a pretzel shell to it. Not super crunchy, so not like the German pretzels, but more like Pretzel Time or Annie Ann's soft pretzels. There we go. But it's not too done. The first time I made these, it took me like so much longer to make, but I've gotten it down to a science now, and it doesn't take me long to whip these guys out. And these are my 13-year-old son's favorite roll. He's always like, whenever I normally always make it with any type of beef stew, and he's like, are we gonna have pretzels? Are we gonna have pretzels? Please tell me we're gonna have pretzels. So yes, we're having pretzels tonight. And the nice thing about this is you can do pretzels, you can top them with salt at the end, or you can top them with like cinnamon sugar for like a dessert pretzel. So you know, my kids love to do both. I'm gonna spread these out so I have room to get 4 rows. Because we're doing 16 pretzels, so we want 4 rows of 4.
You have someone who got their first sourdough kit, and they're going to try to make sourdough this week.
Oh, awesome. You definitely. I will say the kits are a lifesaver. They give you all the little tools that just make it a little bit easier. And like I started without a kit, and then I bought a kit, and it is definitely worth the money. And they're not expensive. But just make sure you do feed and ferment your sourdough, and you should have delicious bread in no time. It's a daunting task to start, but it is so rewarding because who doesn't love fresh bread out of the oven? And I just found that sourdough always comes out so much better than, say, like a yeast bread. Yeast breads can get pretty dry quickly.
You have a question, where are you located?
We are located just outside of Nashville. So I'm gonna give my stew a nice stir since it's to a nice boil, and then I'm just gonna turn it down a few degrees. And as we're waiting, I'm gonna get my water over here on high. It's almost to a boil, but while we wait, we can prep our herbs for our inclusion. So I'm just gonna take that, and I have my herbs over here. We're gonna use some oregano, thyme, chives, and rosemary and fresh basil. So we're gonna use, this is for our sourdough bread. We're gonna use all of the herbs in it and make it a really herby bread.
You have a question? Is this your full-time job?
No, actually, this is kind of what I do for fun. So I am an educational consultant. I do get to work from home. So I just kind of stream what I cook during like lunchtime and dinner. But maybe one day it will be my full-time job.
And guys, let me tell you, like, none of this is for show. She's cooked like this the last 17 years.
Yeah. I cook, we have a big family, so I'm constantly cooking food for them all the time. And I'm a person, we don't waste the food. We eat everything we cook. And so it is just, you know, this is what we eat in our family, and I make it fit around our crazy busy schedules. And because I just, you know, I always grew up with home cooked meals on the table. I never had fast food really, or, you know, frozen dinners. My parents, even though, and we ate late because they were busy, but we always had home cooked meals. And when I was 13, I started actually making the meals for our family. And I'm the youngest of 10, so it was a lot of cooking, but it gave me these great skills.
There's a question, what does your husband do for work?
He works from home, and he does some consulting. So, you know, during the pandemic, we kind of just looked at our jobs, and I used to teach. I actually have my doctorate, and I decided I wanted to stay home when I found out I was pregnant with my 4th kid. And so I haven't looked back, and I've enjoyed every single minute. My 2 little ones definitely keep me on my toes, especially my 5th. I swear he's the naughtiest out of our bunch. We've got some chives here, so oregano, thyme, chives, and then I'm gonna get some rosemary. Break this all up. I'm gonna use like 2 to 3 sprigs of rosemary in here. This is gonna be all for our inclusion on our sourdough bread. I think it's gonna be absolutely delicious. It's gonna be such a herby bread. And then this is my poor basil, my window basil plant. I keep over picking him. I can't wait until we can really start our garden up. And then I'll plant about 10 basil plants that I can go through over the summer. And we use them for cooking, pestos, making lemonade. Purple basil is delicious in lemonade. There we go. Okay. And our water is just about boiling there. So while it gets to a nice boil, I'm just gonna give these a quick chop. And this will be for our sourdough in just a minute. There we go. So we just wanna mince it up nicely so we don't have any super big chunks in our sourdough. And this is just, we're gonna just stretch and fold and add it in our stretch and fold. So it's what you call an inclusion. So it's not being mixed in the dough pre-hand, it's coming after you've established your dough. And I always do it during the first stretch and fold. I know some people do it during the last stretch and fold, but I like to do it in the first stretch and fold because I find that it incorporates a lot better. Okay, we almost have this nice and minced. Give our stew a nice stir. Beautiful. Okay, now we've got our water boiling here, and that has the baking soda in it. Let me find my slotted spoon. You're gonna wanna use a slotted spoon for doing this. And I'm gonna drop 4 of these in at a time. You don't, I find that I can't do more than 4 at a time. 4 is about the perfect amount. And what we're gonna do is we wait about 20, 30 seconds, and then I just poke them to where they flip over, because as you see, dough floats to the top. And you want to get a good boil on both sides. And it doesn't take long. You don't wanna boil it too long. Like a bagel, you boil for 2 minutes. But these are just, 20 to 30 seconds on each side. And then you just pop it over. And that's just gonna give you just a slightly, give you that naturally kind of slightly tougher pretzel crust on a soft pretzel. Now, if you were to do this in lye, you would have a really crunchy pretzel, like the Germans. I prefer a soft pretzel. There we go. I'm gonna pop them out, and then I just make sure I shake off that water. Now we're gonna put it right here, and then I'm gonna get my next 4 in. And this may seem scary, but trust me, you won't burn yourself. You know, it's not that bad. And the bonus is this baking soda water, when I pour it down my sink, I have a white quartz sink. It makes it so clean because the baking soda just like makes everything really bright white again. So that's always a bonus.
You have a question? Do you know what happens if you don't boil them?
They'll be more dry, and so they won't have that moist shell, and I mean the rolls will still puff up, but you won't have that nice crust on it and that shiny shell, and they're more likely to be dry. This seals in the moisture and gives you a nice, you know, moist bread, I would say. I've never not boiled them, but I've made rolls. Like I will say, we have a Swedish, they're called saffron buns that I make during Santa Lucia, and they're similar dough, and we bake it, and they just, you know, they just don't have that nice like pretzel-y crust on them, I will say. And they do puff up just a little bit when you do it. So you can see the ones I'm putting in are quite a bit smaller than the ones that are out, so they kind of speed that like rise up. There we go. And I do just baking soda and water, so not lye, because lye is, you know, a chemical. It can be very caustic if you're not careful with it. So to me, baking soda works. It does its charm. And we're just gonna give them pop them over, give them a nice flip. And easy peasy. And we have 4 more after that we'll dip in, and then what we'll do is we'll mix egg with about a tablespoon of water. We'll beat that up, and then we'll just brush it over the top. And some people salt theirs before they go in the oven. I salt mine afterwards, because what I like to do is take about room temperature soft butter, rub it over the tops, and then I'll add salt, and then I'll keep some of them unsalted because I use them for like a cinnamon sugar pretzel.
2 questions. What kind of dogs do you have? And also, do you have the pretzel dough rise or proof before this?
Yes, I do have it. Okay, I do have it proof before it. I made it about an hour beforehand, so I let it rise for about an hour and a half, and then we did this. And so yes, it's a yeast-based dough, so you want to give it a nice rise until it's at least doubled in size. And then our dogs, they are King Charles Cavalier Spaniels, there we go. And they're little stinkers, I'll tell you that. Especially the one we rescued about 2 years ago. She is like in love with me. Anywhere I go, I have no freedom from her. If I'm in a room where she's not, she paws at the door. But they're cute. I like them because they're supposed to be small, but he's fat. He is the great stealer of foods. He steals food from my 3-year-old and my 1-year-old nonstop. Like, they'll be walking around holding thing, and he just goes up and he's like, oh, it's mine. But we used to have big dogs, and our last dog, his name was Rollo. He was a giant. He weighed 150 pounds, and he was a Greater Swiss Mountain Dog. And if you're not familiar with a Greater Swiss Mountain Dog, they are like a short-haired Bernese Mountain Dog. Beautiful dogs. We love them. But our last one had spine problems, and he was so big and he was so hard to deal with that it just became like he couldn't move. It was funny, for the last 2 to 3 years of his life, he couldn't turn, so he had to back up places to go everywhere because he couldn't turn himself around. And I love that dog. He was hilarious. He was the biggest, gentlest giant ever, but it was hard. I'd have to take him to the vet because 150 pounds, I could not take him to the vet by myself. And You know, and then I was like, smaller dogs, we got to do something smaller for it. So I mixed about 1 tablespoon of water with 1 egg to make an egg wash. And we're just gonna coat the top of this. And this is just gonna give it that nice golden brown color to it, versus if you were to bake it without it, you wouldn't have a golden brown and a little bit of a shine.
You have a question, what's your favorite type of bread to make?
Sourdough. I love sourdough. And honestly, my last specialty loaf I made with chives and Dubliner cheese, which is an Irish cheese similar to a sharp cheddar, was so good. It was, I think that was my favorite. But I love sourdough bread. It is my favorite bread of thing. Just a basic sourdough is just so good, fresh, you know, like eat it about 30 minutes out of the oven. So good. Okay, so we've got these all with a nice coat. We're gonna go put these in the oven, and we're gonna bake them at 450 degrees for about 7 to 8 minutes. They don't take long. Now, if you made bigger ones, they would take a little bit longer. There we go. And then I'm gonna set my timer for 7.5 minutes. And hopefully we'll have dinner and everything ready by then. Okay, before we get to our stew, as you can see, it's lovely. I'm gonna give it a nice stir, because you always wanna make sure you have nothing burning at the bottom of your pot, which you shouldn't if you have a nonstick, but I always like to double check, because if something catches and burns, it tastes terrible. I pour this pot down since we're done with it.
You have a question. Can you make sourdough bread in the future?
Yes, well, I'm making sourdough bread right now. So at the beginning of our stream, we prepped our sourdough bread. And so one is going to be just a basic, and then the other one we chopped up a bunch of herbs for. So I'll actually just bring a bowl here. But we're gonna do our stretch and fold. And I like to do my stretch and fold because the dough in the beginning it's a high hydration dough, so it's pretty sticky. And the way I combat that is I just sprinkle a little flour, rub my hands in it. You could also dip your hands in water and it should like run off, but I find this way thing. We're just gonna stretch and fold it into each other. And we're gonna do that 5 or 6 times, because this is it's breaking up the gluten change, which is gonna give you that nice elasticity in your bread and the delicious breadcrumb. And we'll do this 3 more times, like once every 30 minutes. Okay, so this is for my traditional. And now we'll bring this over here so I can do it with my herbs.
And you have a question, do you have any videos on how to start sourdough from a homemade starter?
Yes, we have how to make the starter, and then I have a couple videos. I think I need to do one that's isolated to just the video, so we'll do that, but I have them that are included in a couple other things where we're making dinner, kind of like how tonight is. So I'm gonna kind of make a little well in here, and then these are all of my fresh herbs that I chopped up, and we're gonna just put them right here. And then what we're gonna do is you're just kind of fold and pull them around. And the first, like stretch and fold, they're not gonna be completely incorporated, but by the time you've done your 4th stretch and fold, they'll be completely and evenly mixed around. You see how you get a nice pop? But this is called, for those who don't know, this is called the inclusion. And we're adding it in. Some people like to add it on their 4th stretch and fold. I like to add it on my 1st one so that the flavors can start sinking in and you get the good stretch. Okay, so we're gonna let this sit, and in 30 minutes, it will be ready for another stretch and fold. But of course, we'll do those off camera after our stream. I'm gonna wash my hands because they're a little sticky. There we go. But I will say, again, sourdough bread, it takes a lot of time, but most of it is passive time. It's very little active time. Okay, let's prep our last herbs for our stew. And we're gonna have some fresh parsley here. So I'm gonna break off a tip that's gonna be about a 1/4 to a 1/3 of a cup. And then we have 5 green onions here. So we're gonna mince these up into things. If I see a big stem, I'm gonna take it out because that will only be chewy in our stew. We're gonna mince it up. There we go. Take a couple of stems out. And this is what we're gonna add at the very end because you don't want them to cook up, because parsley, when it's cooked, it loses all of its flavor. So you want to really toss it in at the very end so that when you get it in your stew, it has that nice bright freshness to it. And you want to give it a nice mince because you don't want to have a super huge leaf of it. And this parsley is just the curly parsley. Now there's Italian parsley, which is a little flatter. And resembles more of like a spring lettuce. Either one, they both have lovely flavors. Either one works well for it. I think it's easier to get curly parsley than it is to get Italian parsley.
You have a question for the outdoor garden. How late in the spring do you wait to start?
I will probably do it. I'll check my forecast, but right at for here in Tennessee, I'll do it right at the end of March, beginning of April, because I know we're typically done with our last frost. And I don't want to be like the crazy person who's running out with sheets the night before to cover up all my plants. My mom made us do that growing up, and there's a couple neighbors in my neighborhood who do that. So I typically wait until the very end of March or the beginning of April to do it. Now, if you're in colder places, you're gonna have to wait a little bit longer. And if you're more south than us, then you should be fine to do it like at the middle of March or beginning of March. It just really depends your location and what zone. I guess there's planting zones, and you gotta know your zones of when to plant. But really, you never know, because sometimes you could get a frost and, you know, that can ruin everything. Like, I had it pop up on my Facebook feed. We had a snowstorm here in Tennessee. It was probably 7 or 8 years ago. And it was like 3 inches of snow. I have like all my kids in their snow gear. And I know it was like when Evie was like, you know, a year and a half, because she's in this cute little pink snowsuit. And I mean, that could happen. But today it was 75 degrees here. So I'm fingers crossed we are done with winter here. Okay, I'm gonna test my potatoes, but I think they're gonna be perfectly tender. This is the beauty about using a yellow potato or a gold potato. They don't disintegrate. So you see how they've kept their shape lovely, but they're nice and soft, like you can push a fork through them. That is what you want. That's why I always recommend those potatoes for soups. If you had a russet in there, it would have completely disintegrated. Okay, this is about a 1/3 cup of green onions, and this is about a 1/3 cup of parsley, between a 1/4 and a 1/3. We're gonna just put them in at the very last, and we're just gonna give it a nice stir. And this, you can see, it gives it a lovely pop of green right at the top, as well as the nice flavors. The parsley will give you that freshness, and the green onions will give you that nice onions flavor.
You have a question. Which potatoes do you say are good for soups?
So I would say the gold potatoes, yellow potatoes, like not a russet, so not an Idaho potato, but or the baby Dutch, or fingerlings. Those are all, they're more waxy, so they don't disintegrate. Versus a russet is good for like French fries or mashed potatoes. But I hear our pretzels are about done. Take this off, and get my gloves out. Beautiful. So you see how they've got nice golden brown edging. Perfect. And then what I like to do when they're nice and hot, you take room temperature butter. So I always have butter left out. I've got my pretzel salt, and then I've got room temperature butter. And you need to have pretzel salt. Regular salt or kosher salt does not work. Pretzel salt has been like put in the liquid and then dehydrated. And then like rehydrated so it's flaky and not as salty as regular salt. So we just take our soft room temperature butter, and you're just gonna take it over the tip of each one, and it's gonna melt on there nicely. Cold butter won't work for this because it just won't melt fast enough. So, and it's hardly, when you're done with it, it's hardly any butter, but it's perfect. And we'll go over the top, and then we're gonna take our pretzel salt, and then I like to pour it in my hand to sprinkle it over because I don't find that it comes out very well. So we're just sprinkle it over. And beautiful. Perfect. And then I'm gonna save my last 4 for cinnamon sugar for dessert pretzels. For a couple of my kids love the cinnamon sugar pretzels.
Where do you find pretzel salt?
I bought this on Amazon, so you can go on there. There is a Boise pretzel salt, which is my favorite. And it's a little bit different. It's like more of a flake versus a granule, but this is like a traditional pretzel salt. Well, guys, let me turn off my stew, and we are ready to serve up dinner tonight. So let me get my little cauldron out and a ladle. Now let's serve up stew. So let's start. We've got our lovely Irish beer and beef stew with carrots and some mushrooms in there. It's beautiful. And then we will have a nice soft pretzel to go with. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us for our stream tonight. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I try to do live cooking shows every single day, kind of show you what we're cooking for our family. But we had a lot of fun making our Irish beef and beer stew, our homemade pretzels, and prepping our sourdough for tomorrow. Again, thanks so much. Don't forget to like and subscribe.